Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The strategic and tactical success of the German Blitzkrieg in the early years of the Second World War remains one of the most significant pivots in military history, primarily because it fundamentally challenged the existing hierarchy of combat power. For centuries, the dominance of the battlefield was determined by the weight of shot, the caliber of artillery, and the thickness of defensive fortifications. The First World War had cemented the doctrine of attrition, where firepower was the ultimate arbiter of victory. Yet, in 1940, the world witnessed the rapid collapse of the French army, considered at the time to be the most powerful and well-equipped force in Europe, not because they were outgunned, but because they were outpaced. To understand why speed, rather than firepower, won the Blitzkrieg, one must dissect the psychological, technological, and operational components that allowed a numerically and qualitatively inferior force in terms of armor to achieve a total systemic collapse of its opposition. The French tanks, such as the Saumur S-35 and the Char B-1 bis, were in many ways superior to their German counterparts, the Panzer III and IV, in both armament and protection. The B-1 bis, in particular, was a literal rolling fortress that German 37mm anti-tank guns could barely scratch. However, firepower is a static metric of potential force. Speed is the kinetic application of that force over time. The German doctrine, influenced heavily by the writings of Heinz Guderian and the operational theories of Hans von Seeckt, emphasized the Schwerpunkt or point of main effort, but more importantly, it emphasized the exploitation of that point through relentless, high-velocity movement. This velocity was not merely physical, it was intellectual and organizational. The German command structure operated on the principle of Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, which allowed subordinate commanders to make rapid decisions on the ground without waiting for approval from a distant high command. This decentralized decision-making process created a tempo of operations that the centralized, top-down French command structure simply could not match. While a French general might take 24 hours to process an intelligence report and issue a counter-order, a German divisional commander could react in minutes. This disparity in the decision-making cycle, later formalized as the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, meant that by the time the French orders arrived at the front, the tactical situation had already changed so fundamentally that the orders were obsolete. This phenomenon is known as paralysis by speed. When an army moves faster than its opponent can perceive, the opponent loses the ability to coordinate a coherent defense. The Blitzkrieg was less about destroying the enemy's tanks and more about destroying the enemy's sense of reality and control. Speed served as a force multiplier that negated the French superiority in firepower. By the time the heavy French tanks were maneuvered into position to confront a breakthrough, the German panzers had already bypassed them, severed their fuel lines, and captured their headquarters. Firepower requires a target to be effective. Speed ensures that the target is never where the firepower is directed. Furthermore, the integration of radio technology played a pivotal role in this victory of tempo. Every German tank was equipped with a radio, allowing for real-time coordination between the armored units and the Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers. The Stuka functioned as a form of mobile artillery that could be summoned within minutes to strike specific obstacles that were slowing the advance. Traditional artillery, while possessing greater firepower, was slow to deploy and required massive logistical tails. The Stuka provided a high-speed alternative that matched the pace of the panzers. This synergy between land and air, facilitated by the speed of communication, allowed the Germans to maintain a momentum that was physically and psychologically exhausting for the Allied defenders. The psychological impact of speed cannot be overstated. The shock in shock and awe is derived from the suddenness of the assault. When German units appeared miles behind what the French believed to be the front line, it created a sense of pan, or tank panic. Soldiers who were not even in direct combat felt the systemic collapse of their defense, leading to mass surrenders. This was a victory achieved through the disruption of the enemy's central nervous system rather than the systematic destruction of their muscular strength. The invasion of France through the Ardennes forest in May 1940 serves as the ultimate proof of this concept. The French believed the Ardennes was impassable for large armored formations, and thus left it lightly defended, relying on the natural firepower of the terrain and the Maginot Line to secure their borders. General Erich von Manstein's Sichelschnitt, or sickle cut plan relied entirely on the speed of the crossing. If the Germans had moved slowly, the French could have shifted their reserves to block the exit at Sedan. However, the speed of Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps was so unexpected that they reached the Meuse River and established bridgeheads before the French High Command even understood the scale of the threat. The subsequent race to the English Channel was a demonstration of pure operational velocity. The Germans were often outrunning their own supply lines, a risk that traditional military doctrine would have deemed suicidal. Yet, the speed itself provided a form of security. By remaining in constant motion, the Germans prevented the Allies from forming a cohesive counterattack. A moving target is harder to hit, but a target moving at the speed of a blitzkrieg is impossible to even track. In this context, firepower becomes a secondary concern. Even if a French tank could destroy 3 German tanks in a head-to-head confrontation, it mattered little if the German tanks had already occupied the logistics hub 50 miles to the rear. The blitzkrieg demonstrated that in modern warfare, the winner is not necessarily the one with the biggest guns, but the one who can project power into the enemy's rear areas the fastest. This reliance on speed over firepower necessitated a new kind of soldier and commander, one who was comfortable with chaos and ambiguity. The German officers were trained to prioritize the momentum of the advance, above all else, often ignoring flanking threats that would have stalled a more cautious, firepower-oriented army. This aggression was fueled by the realization that if the advance stopped, the advantage of speed would vanish, and the superior Allied firepower would eventually grind them down. Therefore, the blitzkrieg was a race against the clock. The eventual failure of this doctrine during Operation Barbarossa in the Soviet Union further illustrates the point. When the vast geography of Russia and the mud of the Rasputitsa slowed the German advance to a crawl, the Soviet Union's superior industrial capacity and firepower began to dominate. Without the shield of speed, the Wehrmacht was forced into the very war of attrition it had sought to avoid. But in the specific context of 1940, it was the velocity of the panzer divisions, the speed of the radio-enabled coordination, and the rapid tempo of the command decisions that shattered the world's most formidable defensive system. The blitzkrieg was the first true, information-age, war fought with industrial-age tools, where the mastery of time was the ultimate weapon. To analyze the blitzkrieg as a triumph of technology or firepower is to miss the fundamental lesson of the campaign, that the disruption of an enemy's command and control through rapid maneuver is a more efficient path to victory than the physical destruction of their forces. The French looked at the battlefield as a map of positions and fire zones, the Germans looked at it as a series of temporal windows. By opening those windows and leaping through them before the enemy could react, the German army proved that speed is the most potent form of firepower. This transition from a linear, firepower-based combat model to a non-linear, speed-based model redefined the nature of conflict for the remainder of the century and beyond. The legacy of the blitzkrieg is not the tank itself, but the realization that the pace of operations can be a decisive weapon in its own right. The synchronization of armored thrusts with tactical air support created a combined arms effect that magnified the impact of speed. While the French tanks were often dispersed among infantry divisions to provide local support, the German tanks were concentrated into independent panzer divisions. This concentration allowed for a massive burst of speed at a single point, creating a breakthrough that could then be exploited. Firepower, when diluted across a wide front, is manageable. Speed, when concentrated into a narrow spearhead, is overwhelming. This organizational innovation was the catalyst that allowed speed to supersede firepower. The German commanders understood that a tank's most valuable attribute was not its gun, but its engine. The ability to move 50 kilometers in a day and strike an undefended rear area was worth more than the ability to win a dozen tactical engagements on the front line. This shift in perspective was the secret of the blitzkrieg. It was a revolutionary understanding of the relationship between time and space in warfare. By collapsing the time it took to move between 2 points, the Germans effectively shrank the space their enemy had to defend. The French, tethered to their slow-moving infantry and their reliance on wired telephone lines for communication, were fighting in a different temporal reality. They were playing a game of chess while their opponent was playing a game of lightning-fast reflexes. In the end, the blitzkrieg was won in the mind of the defender as much as it was won on the ground. The constant, rapid movement of the enemy created a sense of inevitability and helplessness that broke the will of the French soldiers and politicians alike. Firepower kills soldiers, but speed kills armies. This distinction is the core of the blitzkrieg's success. As we look back on the history of 1940, we see a cautionary tale of how an obsession with firepower and defensive strength can lead to a catastrophic failure against an opponent who prioritizes speed, flexibility, and the disruption of the enemy's decision-making process. The Blitzkrieg remains the gold standard for how speed can overcome even the most daunting technological and numerical disadvantages. The total collapse of a superpower in just 6 weeks was a shock that the world had never seen before, and it remains a testament to the power of tempo. The German victory was not an accident of fate or a result of superior weaponry. It was the result of a deliberate, well-executed strategy that placed velocity at the center of its doctrine. In the crucible of the 1940 campaign, the lesson was clear. Firepower provides the means to fight, but speed provides the means to win. The rapid encirclement of the British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army at Dunkirk was the final exclamation point on this thesis. Even at the water's edge, it was the speed of the German advance that had forced the Allies into the sea. Although the halt order and the subsequent evacuation allowed many to escape, the tactical victory of the Blitzkrieg was complete. France had been defeated by an army that was, on paper, less powerful, but in practice, much faster. This historical reality continues to influence modern military thought, where the speed of relevance is often cited as the most critical factor in contemporary operations. The Blitzkrieg was the birth of this concept, a moment when the world learned that the quick can indeed overcome the strong. The internal mechanics of the German army, specifically the relationship between the NCOs and their officers, also contributed to this speed. German soldiers were taught to act on their own initiative to achieve the commander's intent, a concept that minimized the need for constant communication and allowed units to maintain momentum even when cut off from headquarters. This, human speed, was the engine that drove the mechanical speed of the Panzers. Without it, the Blitzkrieg would have been nothing more than a series of fast-moving traffic jams. Instead, it was a fluid, adaptive, and relentless machine that moved with a singular purpose: to stay ahead of the enemy's ability to think. The contrast between this and the Allied approach could not have been starker. The Allies were focused on methodical battle, a slow, controlled advancement that prioritized the careful coordination of firepower. While this approach had worked in the trenches of 1918, it was a disaster in the open maneuver warfare of 1940. By the time the Allied method was ready to be applied, the Germans had already moved the goalposts. This fundamental mismatch in speed and operational philosophy is why the Blitzkrieg was so devastatingly effective. It wasn't just a different way of fighting, it was a different way of perceiving the very nature of conflict. Firepower was the tool of the old world, speed was the herald of the new. The sheer audacity of the German plan, which relied on a single point of failure in the Ardennes, shows how much they banked on speed to mitigate risk. Had the French spotted the traffic jams in the forest and directed their superior artillery firepower toward them, the invasion might have ended in a German catastrophe. But the speed of the movement meant that by the time the French realized the forest was full of tanks, the tanks were already coming out the other side. The gamble of speed over safety was the defining characteristic of the German high command during this period. It was a high-stakes strategy that paid off because the opponent was too slow to seize the opportunity. This brings us back to the central theme. Firepower is only as good as the intelligence and timing that directs it. Speed provides the timing, and in 1940, timing was everything. The world changed in those 6 weeks, and the echoes of that transformation are still felt today in every discussion of military strategy and the role of technology on the battlefield. The victory of speed over firepower was a victory of the future over the past, a victory that would haunt the world for the next 5 years of total war. Even as the war progressed and other nations adapted to the Blitzkrieg, the core lesson remained. The Soviet deep battle doctrine and the American air-land battle of the Cold War were both direct descendants of the lessons learned in the fields of France. They all recognized that to defeat a modern army, one must attack its tempo. The legacy of the Blitzkrieg is a permanent shift in the military balance of power, where the fast will always have a significant advantage over the slow, regardless of the firepower involved. This historical analysis serves as a reminder that innovation is often not about creating a bigger weapon, but about finding a faster way to use the weapons you already have. The Panzer III was not a miracle weapon, but when used at 40 km per hour in a coordinated system, it became one. That is the essence of why speed, not firepower, won the Blitzkrieg. The deep integration of the Luftwaffe as a tactical partner also highlights the speed of the German response. The Stuka, though slow in the air, was incredibly fast in its transition from a request to a strike. The radio links between the forward air controllers and the circling aircraft meant that a bunker or a tank that stopped the Panzer's progress could be targeted and destroyed within minutes. This flying artillery kept the momentum going, ensuring that the Panzers never had to stop and wait for heavy guns to be moved up. This was a revolution in the speed of engagement. In traditional warfare, if you hit a roadblock, you stopped, waited for the artillery, and then attacked. In the Blitzkrieg, you called in an airstrike, bypassed the obstacle, and kept moving. The goal was to keep the river of tanks flowing at all costs. Every hour of delay was an hour given to the enemy to recover. By denying the enemy that time, the Germans maintained a state of permanent crisis within the Allied high command. The French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud's famous phone call to Winston Churchill, saying, "We have been defeated, we are beaten, we have lost the battle," came just 5 days after the main offensive began. This was not because the French army was destroyed, most of it was still intact, but because the speed of the German advance had destroyed the Prime Minister's belief in the possibility of a defense. The psychological collapse preceded the military collapse. This is the ultimate power of speed. It creates a reality where resistance feels futile. Firepower can be countered with armor or fortifications, but there is no easy counter to an enemy who is already behind you. The Blitzkrieg was a masterclass in the operational art of speed, a lesson that cost millions of lives and changed the course of human history. As we examine the details of the 1940 campaign, from the individual tank duels at Hanet and Gembloux to the grand maneuvers across the Meuse, the pattern is consistent. Where the French firepower was applied, it was often effective, but it was rarely applied in the right place at the right time. The Germans, through their mastery of tempo, ensured that they were always the ones dictating the terms of the engagement. They traded safety for speed and firepower for momentum, and in doing so, they achieved one of the most lopsided victories in the annals of war. The speed of the Blitzkrieg was a symphony of technology, doctrine, and human initiative, all working together to outrun the enemy's ability to cope with a rapidly changing environment. This is why the Blitzkrieg is studied in every military academy in the world today. It is the definitive example of how a focus on tempo can paralyze and destroy a much larger and more powerful force. The final collapse of France in June 1940 was merely the conclusion of a story that had been written in the first week of the invasion. The speed of the opening moves had created a momentum that could not be stopped. The fire had been set, and the lightning had struck, leaving a continent in ruins and a new era of warfare in its wake. The historical consensus, when looking past the propaganda of the time, confirms that the German advantage lay in their process, not their steel. Their tanks were adequate, their planes were good, but their speed was revolutionary. In the final analysis, the victory was won by the watch and the radio, more than the cannon and the shell. This serves as a timeless principle. In any competition, the ability to act and adapt faster than your opponent is the most decisive advantage of all. The Blitzkrieg was the first and most terrifying demonstration of this truth on a global scale. The intricate dance of the Panzer divisions, the relentless drone of the Stukas, and the desperate, futile orders of the French generals all point to a single conclusion. The winner was the one who could move, the one who could think, and the one who could strike before the other side even knew the fight had begun. This is the true legacy of the Blitzkrieg, a legacy of speed that redefined the world. Even the logistical challenges, which were immense, were solved through a speed-first mentality. When the Panzers ran out of fuel, they didn't wait for the slow-moving supply columns. They captured French fuel depots or used the jerry-can system, another innovation in speed, to refuel quickly from trucks that followed closely behind the tanks. Every aspect of the German military machine was optimized for the maintenance of tempo. This holistic approach to speed is what made the Blitzkrieg a systemic success. It wasn't just a tactical trick, it was a comprehensive philosophy of war that integrated technology, logistics, and psychology into a single, high-speed weapon. The firepower of the Maginot Line, with its massive guns and invincible bunkers, was rendered completely irrelevant because it was stationary. The Germans simply drove around it. This is perhaps the most famous example of how speed can negate firepower. 1,000 cannons are useless if they are pointing in the wrong direction and cannot be moved. The mobility of the German army made the static defenses of the French obsolete overnight. The world watched in horror as the invincible defense was bypassed in a matter of days. This was the moment when the cult of the defensive, which had dominated military thinking since the time of Vauban, was finally shattered. The new era belonged to the offensive, and specifically, to the high-speed, armored offensive. The lessons of the Blitzkrieg were hard-won and had a profound impact on the subsequent development of every major military in the world. The shift from firepower to speed was not just a change in tactics, it was a change in the way humans thought about conflict. The lightning war was a phenomenon that could only have happened in the mid-20th century, but its core principles are universal and eternal. Speed remains the primary objective of any modern military force, from the shock and awe of the Gulf War to the rapid maneuvers of contemporary digital age conflicts. The ghost of the Blitzkrieg still haunts the battlefield, reminding us that the fastest actor will almost always be the one who dictates the outcome. The depth of the German success in 1940 was a direct result of their willingness to embrace this truth, even at the cost of traditional military wisdom. They saw a world that was moving faster and they built an army to match it. The French, blinded by the lessons of the past and the comfort of their superior firepower, were left behind in the dust of the Panzer's tracks. This is the ultimate analytical conclusion: speed is not just a way to move, it is a way to win. It is the ability to transform potential energy into kinetic destruction faster than the enemy can react. The Blitzkrieg was the first time this was done with such devastating clarity, and it remains the most powerful example of how the pace of operations can be the most important factor in the history of war. The firepower was there, on both sides, but the speed was only on one. And that made all the difference.